the Department of English, Egra Sharoda Shashi Bhushan College. Today is the 9th day of the 14-day series of online lectures and the 11th consecutive lecture of the series starting on and from 17 June 2020. Today, there is among us Dr. Gautam Buddha Sural, Professor, Department of English, Bankura University, Bankura. We all know Professor G.B. Sural as one of the most erudite speakers of our state. He is not only an eloquent speaker of our state, he is not only an eloquent speaker of our state, his lectures are always full of information and quite inquisitive. So far, my knowledge is concerned, as Hopkins is a part of both UG and PG courses of studies in English. Before I request Dr. Sural to start his deliberation, one thing I want to mention, I seek apology to our sir. Sir, for the time being, I will have to leave you your lecture as I will have to join another
series. And the way you have introduced me, I think I don't deserve so much of introduction. Anyway, basically, I am a teacher. I was a teacher when I joined Bankura Christian College, and I am still a teacher. That is the most important identity of myself, I think. And today, actually, when Joyanto asked me for a lecture, he requested me for a lecture and asked my title. I could not specify. But today, I think I will be specifying my talk, and I will be focusing on the ecological aspects of Hopkins's poetry. I will be showing you my title just a little while from now. And another important thing I should mention is that usually our appreciation of Gerard Manley Hopkins is as a religious poet, particularly among the UG and PG students. They know him as a religious poet. Side by side, there is a tendency, that is my experience over the years, that they find him very difficult, and that's why usually they don't choose him for examinations, right? So of course that is your choice, but I find Hopkins very interesting because I have worked for my PhD with Hopkins and the Prerephilites also. So still, Hopkins is a very living interest in me. He, as I read him, he always creates a renewed interest in me to revisit his poems, to revisit his writings, and discover him in newer and newer ways. And let me tell you that research is on. I think he is one of the most important Victorian poets on whom the research is still ongoing, and during my lecture you will find that critics and scholars, they are coming out with publications, and very revealing publications, aspects of Hopkins's poetry which have not been dealt with so far. So let me, I have a PPT presentation for you. So during my lecture I will be presenting that, and just 1 minute, you will see my title here. Yes, so this is the title, Green Man Hopkins, Priest of Ecology. Now, you see the title within quotes, Green Man Hopkins. This is actually the name of a book by John Parham, which came out in 2010. So I'll be referring to this book from time to time in my talk. And you know that F.L. Lewis, in his book New Bearings in English Poetry, claimed that Hopkins is likely to, I'm quoting F.L. Lewis, Hopkins is likely to prove for our times and future the only influential poet of the Victorian age, and he seems to me the greatest. unquote. This is F.L. Lewis writing in New Bearings in English Poetry, published in 1932. Now, whether Hopkins can be acknowledged as the greatest poet of the Victorian period, that may always be contested, but the fact remains that in the Victorian period, in the field of green issues, Hopkins is possibly the most important poet. Jerome Bump is one of the most important critics on Hopkins. Jerome Bump, in his article, Hopkins, the Humanities, the Environment, published in 1974, in Georgia Review, points out that poetry can play a useful role in interdisciplinary environmental science. According to him, poets in many ways have anticipated environmental scientists and have expressed their ideas in definite, convincing, and forceful language. But discussions on the mutual relationship between poetry of the 19th century and ecology are not many, and if one goes back to Victorian literature, such discussions are even less. Bump points out that some writers on environmental issues mention Dickens's Hard Times, of course, and sometimes Ruskin. You can see Bump says some writers on environmental issues mention Dickens's Hard Times, of course, and sometimes Ruskin, but I'm yet to find anybody who is even aware of the contributions of, say, Gerard Manley Hopkins. And in that same essay, later he says that Hopkins's affinities with the modern ecology movement have hardly been noticed in the more than 1,500 books and articles on him which have appeared since the publication of his poems in 1918. So this was Bump writing in 1974, right? After that, many books have been published, many articles have been published. Now, Jonathan Bett edited his edited book, Romantic Ecology, Wordsworth and the Environmental Tradition, which was published in 1991. That book is often regarded as a pioneering work in the field. But the book, as the title suggests, does not focus on Victorian poets, though there are passing references of major Victorian poets, including Hopkins. There is, however, some discussion on Ruskin and William Morris in the first and second chapters of the book. In the 21st century, there is, however, a renewed interest in Hopkins's poetry, and a number of articles appear in different international journals focusing on the ecological aspect in Hopkins's poetry. In 2002 came out a book titled The Environmental Tradition in English Literature, edited by John Perham. I have mentioned this author, whose book I have mentioned in the title, but he edited another volume before that. The name of the volume is The Environmental Tradition in English Literature, edited by Perham, in which the editor himself contributed an essay, Was There a Victorian Ecology? That was the title of Perham's essay in his own edited book. In that essay, Perham discusses a number of Victorian poets and finally asserts that Hopkins was the one Victorian poet who consistently recreated the specific conditions of itself. So you can understand the importance of such a comment. In 2004, in another article, Hopkins' Spiritual Ecology in Binse Poplars. Binse Poplars is one important poem by Hopkins. So the title of the article, published in 2004, Hopkins' Spiritual Ecology in Binse Poplars. It was published in Victorian Poetry in 2004, and the writer is Brian J. Day. Brian J. Day observes that even though Hopkins' poetry offers us insights into our own 21st century ecological discourse, and his ecological sensibility flows into the broad stream of ecological nature writing, his place in the canon of ecological thinkers has been largely ignored. Unquote. According to Day, Hopkins's ecology is fundamentally spiritual. The tripartite relationship between nature, the created world, and God is central to Hopkins's poetry. The most interesting publication is a book published in 2010, the book that I have just mentioned, by John Parham, whom I have already mentioned. The book's title is interesting. Parham substitutes the first two letters of Hopkins's first and middle name. We know Gerard Manley Hopkins, his full name. So he substitutes Hopkins's first and middle name, and the title of the book is, as I've shown you, Green Man Hopkins, Poetry and the Victorian Ecological Imagination. That is the full title, right? So there are a number of poems by Hopkins which exemplify a perfect agreement between Christian religiosity and his sense of deep ecology. You can go on naming the poems. I mentioned some of them: God's Grandeur, Spring, The Sea and the Skylark, Pied Beauty, Binse Poplars, Inverse Ned, Rebel's Dale, and so many other poems. In many of these poems, Hopkins celebrates his love for nature and his sensuous pleasures. But at the same time, his poems reflect his distress and anxiety at the destruction of nature and landscape. In poems like God's Grandeur and Binse Poplars, Hopkins unambiguously writes about the pervasive impact of industrial revolution on environment. The two poems clearly voice a protest against soil pollution and deforestation and critique the destruction of nature by man in the name of industrialization. We have to remember here that Hopkins was neither averse to modernization, nor was he against industrialization per se, but he was against the mindless expansion of industry and urbanization. Jude Nixon explains that, I quote from Jude Nixon's essay, Death Bolts Blackout. The essay is, you can see at the bottom, I have mentioned the reference, Death Bolts Blackout, Blots Blackout, Thermodynamics and the Poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. The title itself indicates Hopkins's interest in science. So I go back to the quotation. Hopkins's conversion to Roman Catholicism and Jesuit affiliation granted him membership in a religious community open to scientific inquiry on the grounds that science reveals the mystery of the universe and is ultimately compatible with church dogma. Issues raised by the biological and geological sciences unsettled Victorians as well as Roman Catholic Victorians like St. George Mivart, who imagined that there were in fact solutions within emerging scientific theories not incompatible to faith. So this quotation throws light to another of Hopkins's identity as a poet, because shining from shook foil, it gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. The world is the world of nature that he describes in this poem. The world is the world of nature, the world of created beauty, which is pervaded by the power of God. But the power is latent, and it may reveal itself any moment in the manner of the sudden flash of lightning. Hopkins compares the momentary flash of God's power with the sudden flash of a gold foil shaken in the sunlight. The opening lines of the poem closely echo Hopkins's commentary on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola. The commentary goes like this: the last mystery meditated on in the spiritual exercises is our Lord's ascension. It is the contemplation of the Holy Ghost sent to us to creatures. All things, therefore, are charged with love, are charged with God. And if we know how to touch them, give off sparks, and take fire into drops, read and tell of Him. The above account is almost a prose rendering of the opening lines of the sonnet. The world is charged with the God. That's how Hopkins begins the poem. The same light imagery is at work. In his essay, Hopkins and the Religion of the Diamond Body, published in the Cambridge Quarterly in 1998, Keith Sagar observes, you see, this is Keith Sagar's observation, the fourth word is charged with meaning and plunges us deep into Hopkins's distinctive poetic and religious world. Right. So the fourth word, the world is charged. He's referring to that particular word. Fourth word is charged with meanings and plunges us deep into Hopkins's distinctive poetic and religious world. The primary meaning is, of course, electrical. It suggests that God flows through the world as an energizing current, that everything in creation is therefore connected to everything else, part of the same circuit, and also to God, the source. It also suggests that the world is a huge battery in which creative energy lies latent, in which is stored an infinite potential for which people lack, and the poet grieves, why do men then now not wreak his rod? That is the anguished questioning of Hopkins in the poem. And in the next four lines, the poet laments of what man has made of man and the resultant mangling of nature by man. The repetition of the phrase, have trod, have trod, have trod, when read aloud, conveys to the reader the sense of havoc caused by industry. I go back to John Parham's book and his observation. So he observes, in the brutal repetition of have trod, have trod, have trod, Hopkins succeeds in conveying industrial impacts rhythmically, not just on the ground, but in the ground. The underlying ecosystem, more than just an abstract environment, disfigured or altered by a human dominance, threatening to create a monoculture, rears man's marge and shares man's smell. Right. So the poem categorically points to the desensitization of human beings caused by industrialization. Nor can foot fill being shod. So you can understand there is a detachment between nature and man. But the negative impact is countered by the poet's assertion that despite this, nature is never spent, as there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And the poem moves on to trace the source of the freshness in the Holy Ghost, who constantly rejuvenates nature. There is a hidden message, which is that if the ecosystem is harmed, humanity will suffer its consequence, but nature will be continually refreshed and energized regardless of human society and its industrial practices. The unmistakable note of anxiety expressed by the poet due to destruction of nature is assuaged by his faith in God, the ultimate source of energy. So when Brian J. says that Hopkins's ecology is a spiritual ecology, we can understand the significance of such a phrase. Now, the very important poem about which Hopkins himself said 2 years after its composition, the poem I am referring to, The Windower, this is, according to Hopkins, the best thing I ever wrote. And it was his judgment 2 years after composing this poem. It was composed in 1877, and in 1879 Hopkins said these words, that this is the best thing I ever wrote. So you can understand the importance of this poem in Hopkins' canon, and this is in the syllabi of most of the universities. So I have chosen this to briefly discuss in connection with Hopkins's interest in ecology. So the poem starts like this. I caught this morning's minion, king, dumb of delights, doffin, dapple, don, drawn, falcon in his riding, of the rolling level underneath him steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, etc., etc. So, this is a poem about which the poet himself said, as I say, that the best thing I ever wrote. And the bird's energy, you see the first line, the verb use in the first line, I caught. The bird's energy has to be caught. The choice of the word caught, this is significant. The emphasis is not so much on the bird's flight as a spectacle, but on its power over the wind. Hopkins could have used a verb like see or saw, the past tense of see, saw he could have used instead of caught, had he prioritized the visual aspect of the bird's flight. The alliteration in the second line corroborates this view with the repetitive use of the plosive sound do. You can see he breaks the word kingdom even, and for sonorous effect, for this alliterative effect, he brings the second part of the word kingdom, that is the dumb, in the second line, and the line reads like dumb of delights, doffin, dapple, don, drawn, falcon in his riding. So this repetitive use of the do has got a very important role to play, because do, as I've mentioned, is a plosive. And you know, when we utter plosive sounds, the stricture involved in the case of pronunciation is a complete closure of the airstream which comes out from the lungs during pronunciation of words. It is completely stopped and then suddenly released. And Hopkins's point, which he wants to convey perhaps, is that the bird breaks out from its nest attracted by the morning dawn with its full energy. So as the bird is coming out of its nest, drawn by the multicolored dawn, it unleashes its energy with great gusto and rides over the wind with complete mastery. In this connection, let me quote the words of John Parham. He writes, "It is specifically an ecological sense of the bird's energy that is caught in these first 6 lines as Hopkins depicts the falcon working with and against the wind. The octave represents, therefore, in the fullest possible sense, an example of an eco-poetry that unifies eco and technocentric perspectives." Right. Claude Collier Abbott, in his introduction to the letters of Gerard Manley Hopkins to Robert Bridges, argues that in many of Hopkins's nature poems, the impressionism of the octave in effect overpowers the exemplum of the sestet. I quote this. This is by Claude Collier Abbott in the introduction to Letters of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Abbott says, they are poems written to the glory of God by a man who is looking on the world as charged with his grandeur and revealing his bounty and presence. But always, as I read them, I feel that the poet is primarily seized by the beauty of earth, and that though a man of exquisitely tempered and religious mind, his senses, not his religion, are in the ascendant. His visions of earth and her creatures make a bevy of astonishing and new felicities rarely to be matched in English poetry, in which the fusion of earthly beauty and exemplum is often so incomplete that the second is merely the addendum of a poet captive in the first place to the beauty besieging his senses. The loveliness is here for its own sake." Unquote. These words of Abbott immediately remind us of Hopkins's poem Pied Beauty, which may be regarded as a poem celebrating biodiversity. The poem begins and ends with a thanksgiving to God for the dappleness one finds in nature. The poem proceeds through a depiction of a variety of beautiful things which are variegated or contain contrariety of various kinds: color, taste, speed, brightness, to an affirmation of the Creator of them, in whom lies the supreme gift of resolving the paradoxes within his unity. Hopkins' another poem, Vince Populus, may be regarded as an elegiac preservationist protest against the felling of poplar trees at Glasgow, Oxford. Trees and flowers were central to Hopkins' philosophy of nature, and many of his letters and journal entries bear proof to this. For him, hacking a tree is equal to wiping out the inscape of the world. In one of his journal entries, he records his deep anguish at the felling of an ash tree. He writes, you can see, the ash tree growing in the corner of the garden was felled. It was lopped first. I heard the sound, and looking out and seeing it maimed, there came at the moment a great bang, and I wished to die and not see the inscapes of the world destroyed any more. See the sensitive response of Hopkins while the ash trees were being felled. In another of his letters, written to his mother on October 19, 1863, Hopkins expressed his agony in more uncompromising words. The following words will show his agony even deeper. They have cut down the beautiful beech in the garden quad. This is a picture of a beech tree, and we are all familiar with, if not the picture, at least the description of a beech tree thickly foliaged in Keats's poem Ode to a Nightingale. Right, the beechen green, the phrase. So anyway, come back to this quotation, which is from Hopkins' letter to his mother. They have cut down the beautiful beech in the garden quad, which stood in the angle of Fisher's buildings, because it was said to darken their rooms. See the reason why the trees were cut, because it was said to darken their rooms. This is a wicked thing. Such a beech, no doubt, has not its like in Oxford, beech being a rare tree here. Its destruction is owing to the fellows Green and Newman. The former is of a rather offensive style of infidelity and naturally dislikes the beauties of nature. It is said that Fisher's buildings are to be pulled down. I wish they could have pulled them down first and let the tree stand. See his reaction. Just let me remind you that this Newman is not John Cardinal Henry Newman. This is another Newman, who is an ancient historian, William Lambert Newman, that he is referring to. Right. So when Hopkins returned to Oxford as a priest, he lamented in letter to R.W. Dixon the absence of natural beauty he had known as an undergraduate. He wrote that it was already abridged. These are at times I'm using quotations. He wrote that it was, quote unquote, already abridged and soured and perhaps will be put out altogether. And then in a postscript to the letter, he added, quote unquote, I have been up to Godstow this afternoon. I am sorry to say that the aspens that lined the river are everyone felled. This is a letter he writes to R.W. Dixon on 27 to 89, right, 1889. Now, Vince Populus was closed on the same day. The poem begins thus. I'm not going to read the full poem, just the first few lines you can see. Vince Populus, which is, again, you can see the subtitle is, there is a note after that, after the title, Felled 1879, right. My aspens dear, those airy cages quelled or quenched in leaves the leaping sun, all felled, are all felled, of a fresh and flowing folded rank, not spared, not one that dandled a sandaled shadow that swam or sank on meadow and river and wind-wandering, weed-winding bank. Oh, if we but knew what we do when we delve or hew and rack the growing green. And in this connection, I have mentioned the article already. Brian J. Day, in his article, Hopkins' Spiritual Ecology in Bonsai Poplars, he observes that the tree's suffering is Christ's suffering, right? The words that we have just read that speaks of this, the tree's suffering is Christ's suffering in the loss of its Christ-like perfection. This being so, Hopkins under no obligation to move away from the tree in equating its fate with the aspen is dear because Christ is dear. The perception of one makes possible the perception of the other. Inkscape, therefore, does not move Hopkins away from the thing into the realm of transcendental signifiers, but keep him looking at the thing itself, even as he perceives Christ's sacrifice. So these are very important words which explain Hopkins' spiritual ecology. So the dedicatory note, which we have already seen, Fales 1879, conveys the deep sense of loss due to the strokes of havoc that unselved the sweet special rural scene. The first two lines of the poem refer to the process of photosynthesis of the lopped trees. Parham in his book says, I quote, "My aspens dear immediately gives way to an embodiment of photosynthesis fundamental to the ecological process." And Brian J. Day also convincingly argues that the trees can be interpreted as vegetal lungs whose leaves quell or quench the sun by transforming one form of energy into another through photosynthesis, a concept known by that time and one which Hopkins, a contributor to scientific journals and a reader of Ruskin, would have known and understood. So Hopkins contributed letters to journals, and you will be surprised to know that he even contributed to the journal which is most famous even today in the field of science, Nature. In that journal, Hopkins contributed his letter, right? The phrase airy cages, we can go back to the poem, you can see my aspens dear whose airy cages. So the phrase airy cages also refers to the foliage, which is metaphorically compared to cages that imprison the sun rays to maintain the balance in the ecosystem. The repetition of the word felled emphatically communicates the destruction caused by humankind to nature and has an obvious reference to man's fall, the sense of which is aptly conveyed by the lines, "Oh, if we but knew what we do when we delve or hew, hack and wreck the growing green." The words remind us of Christ's words on the cross. Christ said while he was being crucified, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Right? And when the trees are being felled, the cutters, the people who are cutting the trees, possibly they do not know when we delve or hew, hack and wreck the growing green, what we are doing. So the unselving of the poplars not only robs the nature of its sweet special rural scene, it also suggests that if this special scene cannot be seen by the posterity, Hopkins uses aftercomers, you can see towards the end of the poem, he says, aftercomers cannot guess the beauty bin. Now these aftercomers, they are the posterity. So it is suggested that if the special sin cannot be seen by the posterity, then it is also a sin, S-I-N sin, committed against God, as the destruction of the poplars signifies the destruction of the Inkscape of God. The Inkscapes that Hopkins found in nature were a means to apprehend the glory of God. For example, on May 18, 1870, Hopkins records in his journal, I'm quoting from the journal, "One day, when the bluebells were in bloom, I wrote the following. I do not think I have ever seen anything more beautiful than the bluebell I have been looking at. I know the beauty of our Lord by it." So the condemnation of 19th century urbanization and industrialization is explicitly conveyed in poems like Duns Scotus's Oxford and The Sea and the Skylark. While a sense of nostalgia for the cheer and charm of Earth's past prime can clearly be felt in these poems, they simultaneously disapprove the destruction of nature for the spread of shabby townships. The poet in Duns Scotus's Oxford wrote, see the poem, this first few lines, thou hast a bare and brickish scot there, sowers that never nature thy grey beauty is grounded best in graceless growth. Thou hast confounded rural keeping, folk, flocks, and flowers. So he is talking about graceless growth in Oxford. Nature is being destroyed and the concrete jungle that is coming up. So the beautiful medieval Oxford, surrounded by natural beauty, is corrupted by the growth of modern industry and setting up of townships. These have turned Oxford into a graceless town full of ugly structures of bricks. The city now stands defolked, deflocked, deflowered. The lines remind us of Ruskin's lament at nature being spoilt by industrial blight. I may draw your attention here to the words of John Ruskin in one of his lectures, Modern Manufacture and Design, which he delivered at Bradford in March 1859. I'm quoting John Ruskin. He says, and let me point out that Ruskin was a major influence on Gerard Manley Hopkins and also the Pre-Raphaelites. In fact, John Ruskin acted as a conduit, as Arnold also to some extent, Matthew Arnold also to an extent acted as a conduit between Hopkins and the Pre-Raphaelites. So these are the words from the lecture by Ruskin. The changes in the state of this country are now so rapid that it would be wholly absurd to endeavor to lay down laws of art education for it under its present aspect and circumstances. He was invited to give suggestions to architectures. So Ruskin writes this, and therefore I must necessarily ask, how much of it do you seriously intend within the next 50 years to be coal pit, brick-filled, or quarry? From shore to shore, the whole of the island is to be set as thick with chimneys as the masts stand in the docks of Liverpool. And there shall be no meadows in it, no trees, no gardens. That the smoke having rendered the light of the sun unserviceable, you work always by the light of your own gas. That no acre of English ground shall be without its shaft and its engine, and therefore no spot of English ground left on which shall be possible to stand without a definite and calculable chance of being blown off it at any moment into small pieces. So this is John Ruskin talking about the dangerous condition of England going for all-out industrialization. The words are self-revelatory. The industry has blighted the beautiful green and the smoke, the darkness, the sunlight becoming unserviceable, speak not just of the hellish possessions of the sweet special sin by the satanic mills, they also embody man's spiritual wreck. Hopkins's poem, The Sea and the Skylark, Hopkins writes, how these two shame the shallow and frail town. Sea and the skylark, these are the two things. How these two shame this shallow and frail town. How wring right out our sordid turbid time. A phrase which is potent with meaning. Dead time, sordid, turbid time. How wring right out our sordid, turbid time, being pure. We, like pride and cared for crown, have lost that cheer and charm of earth's past prime. Our make and making brick are breaking down to man's last dust, drain first towards man's first slime. The lull and roar of the sea waves and the skylark's music put to shame man's shallow and frail town. The two sounds shut out from the speaker's experience the sordid, turbid time. They give us a vision of happiness to be found in the world of nature. But men immersed in materialism cannot respond to this. The natural world represented by the sea and the skylark in the octave is contrasted with the world of men in the sestet. The sestet is a condemnation of the human intuition which has made the present world lose the cheer and charm of earth's past prime. Words like shallow, frail, sordid, turbid speak of the ugliness of industrial towns and also convey a sense of decay and pollution. The last line refers to man's spiritual degeneration and hints at a reversal of Darwin's theory of evolution as it illustrates the complete regression of mankind back to inanimate matter or slime. Before I conclude, I would like to draw attention to another of Hopkins's lyrics, Inversement. In 1881, Hopkins became an assistant pastor at a Jesuit church in Glasgow, Scotland. While he was there, he visited Inversned, a village located on the east bank of Loch Lomond in Scotland. The focus of the poem is on a mountain stream rushing down the hillside and emptying itself into the lake. The first three stanzas pictorially describe the different parts of the Highland stream and its untamable force. The final stanza is an environmental plea to save the natural wildness, and even today, nothing can be more appealing than the lines which plead for conservation of backwoods. Conservation of backwoods. See the lines. What would the world be? What would the world be once bereft of wet and wilderness? Let them be left. Oh, let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. So this is an impassioned plea on the part of the poet to the people of the world that don't destroy nature, because you destroy nature, you destroy yourself. So the poems of Hopkins definitely confirm, as observed by John Perham, that he achieved, quote unquote, a fully recognizable Victorian ecology. Many of his poems focus on the interactions between the physical, biological, and chemical environment. Such poems speak of the need to build a sustainable existence on this planet by dwelling on the interaction between humans, animals, and the environment with specific reference to the effects of modern technological advances. I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that reading of Hopkins's poems and his journal entries can help us gain an understanding of the role ecology plays in conservation, wetland and natural resource management and forestry. As I conclude, I would like to refer to the words of Brian J. Day. He says in that article, Hopkins' Spiritual Ecology in Vinci Poplars, Brian J. Day observes, his framing of ecological concerns is in intensely theological, moral, and spiritual terms marks him out as eminently Victorian. But at the heart of the spiritual ecology is the belief that all undefined nature, rightly perceived, is sacred, or as we might say in more secular terms, possesses intrinsic value, and that what we do to it, we do to ourselves. Unquote. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for such a nice, well-researched and engaging lecture. Now the forum is open for our students and participants to clear their doubts. If there is any, you may drop your queries in the chat box, or you may ask it directly to our sir, respected sir, by switching on your microphone. So there is a question in the drop box.
Yes.
It was from Sudipta Banerjee.
Yes.
Sir, when Wendover, Felix Randall, Kylark. During my postgraduate days, I was certainly feeling that there is a stark similarity between Wordsworth and Hopkins. I find Hopkins bears the legacy of Wordsworth in his pantheistic attitude. What is your take on this? Can both be read parallelly? And can we think of Hopkins as a Victorian romantic to some extent?
Yes, absolutely. You can always think like that because if we see the Victorian poets, they are continuing, as a whole, they are continuing the legacy of the Romantics in many ways. So there is no bridge between the Romantics and the Victorians. And as far as Wordsworth and Hopkins reading side by side, whether you can read them parallelly, yes, of course, because Wordsworth's love for nature is in many ways reflected in Hopkins. Only thing that Hopkins expresses is, as I have mentioned in my paper, he mentions his anguish, his anxiety, his pain when during the Victorian period, England was going for industrialization in rapid pace, destroying nature to a great extent. So that possibly was not a picture during Wordsworth's time. So the Romantic period did not see industrialization in its full form. But during the Victorian period, the Victorians, they actually experienced that, and Hopkins reacted to it very sharply. And the poignant language that he uses at times in his poems and journal entries prove only that. So I agree to what you say that, yes, he bears the legacy of the Romantics. And all the Victorian poets, in fact, they are influenced by the Romantic poets. And as far as the sensuous response of Hopkins to nature is concerned, bears a direct legacy of John Keats.
Hello. Thank you.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Yes, sir. Sir, first of all, I have been extremely enjoyed and enriched by your outstanding lecture. Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Sir, how was T.S. Eliot influenced by Hopkins to introduce his new movement poetry?
T.S. Eliot and you'd say that Hopkins and T.S. Eliot, how Hopkins influenced T.S. Eliot?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Yes, I am afraid that I will not be able to address your question properly because direct, I think, material on this kind of an influence I have not yet come across. But then definitely Hopkins was a potent influence on Dylan Thomas, on modern poets like T.S. Eliot. There is no doubt about it. But as far as specific influence, if you ask me, I'm not in a position to answer that, I'm afraid. If you have any inputs, you can just enlighten the audience. Hello? Go on.
Yes, sir.
The question. Yes. If you have any inputs, you can just enlighten us by your inputs. Right. Despite I can say that, yes, Eliot was influenced to some extent, as all the modern poets, they were influenced by Hopkins, particularly his use of language. That is one important thing, right? One important aspect which influenced the subsequent poets, as I mentioned, Dylan Thomas, because both of them are from Wales. One is from South Wales, the other is from North Wales. Right.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Any other question?
Sir, there is another from one of our students.
Yes.
I'm quoting his question.
Yes.
In his red letter to Robert Bridges, Hopkins stated, "I am afraid some great revolution is not far off. Horrible to say, I am a communist." Did he try to show his phobia in communism, or he actually wanted to become a communist?
Yes, this is something very difficult to say, but as far as what Hopkins thought, whether he himself thought as a communist or not. But then definitely you have to, when you are reading such letters, you have to remember in mind or keep in mind the socio-political scenario. We just read Hopkins as I have said at the outset of my lecture, as a religious poet who possibly was not aware of the contemporary socio-political events or happenings around him. It was not at all so, because he was aware of the fact that Ireland, being a Catholic country with which he felt one from the religious point of view, was a colony colony of the British, and they were fighting for their independence. The thing that you find in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man. So that was there. It was very painful for him to be divided between these two interests, because if you think of him nationally, he was a British national, and then because he was converted to Roman Catholicism and he was shifted to Ireland, to Dublin, because he was a teacher there in Dublin, lived there for 5 long years from 1880 to 1885. So this tension was very much there. On the one hand, he was one with the Irish people, but he was not in a position to side with them utterly, because they were trying to get their freedom from the British, from British rule. And as I mentioned in one of my lectures, that Hopkins even was aware of the British colonial rule in India. And in no uncertain terms, he mentioned that the British should withdraw from India, right? So he was aware. And when he writes such words to Robert Bridges, actually, you have to keep in mind that he was responding to contemporary situation. And when he says that I'm a communist, possibly he was thinking of the plight of the mass, right? He was a religious poet. He had firm belief in God, but at the same time, when he says that I'm afraid whether I'm a communist or not, when he expresses this kind of an expression, he says he feels perhaps that he is with the mass. Whether his belief in God is obstructing that or not, that is a different issue. But then he felt that he was one with the toiling mass, particularly those people of Ireland who were struggling for their freedom from the clutches of the British. Right.
Sir, there is another question from Manasi Jana.
Yes.
Sir, we came to know that Hopkins had burnt many of his writings.
Yes.
Was there any big reason?
Was there any?
Big reason?
Yes. Because if you see the journals and diaries of Hopkins, you will find that Hopkins mentions this burning of the poems as slaughter or murder of the innocents. Because when he did this, he was about to join the Catholic novitiate. He was converted to 1866 to Catholicism, and then in 1868 he became a Jesuit priest, and he burned those poems possibly, and as I mentioned, he records this as murder or slaughter of the innocents. Innocents, he refers to the first phase poetry that he composed, and he did this perhaps because he thought that his fame and name as a poet, that would hinder his spiritual progress as a priest. So this kind of a conflict possibly made him take that decision to burn those poems. But at the same time, we have all his early poems almost intact, because with the burning, everything was not lost, as all is not lost, as Satan says, with the losing of heaven, all is not lost. So with Hopkins also, all is not lost, because Robert Bridges, who was his close friend, and I can say that closest friend perhaps, so he kept a copy of Hopkins's poems. Every time Hopkins composed a poem, he used to send a copy to Robert Bridges. So he was a very meticulous keeper of Hopkins's manuscripts. So when Hopkins burned those poems, most of the poems, they were not lost because the copies were there with Robert Bridges. So when Hopkins's a volume of poetry came out in 1918 for the first time, published by University Press, what you find is that there are early poems, a number of early poems included in that, right? So this was the reason that possibly he felt a conflict because he thought that his religious vocation will be hindered if he continues to enjoy praise as a poet, right?
So there is another question from one of our students, Parthupratim Dey. In 1888, why Hopkins wrote, "I am an eunuch"?
Yes, that's what he says also. In 1889, the last but one poem, "Thou art indeed just Lord," he says that I am a eunuch. And you will find when he writes to Bridges, his experience about the Dublin days, his days in Ireland. I think, well, let me see if I can find out, just 1 minute, if I can find out the words. So he was feeling terribly depressed. And in January 1888, yes, you say that January 1888, that letter he writes to Bridges that, what is my wretched life? Possibly you are referring to this. 5 wasted years almost have passed in Ireland. I'm ashamed of the little I have done, of my waste of time, although my helplessness and weakness is such that I could scarcely do ourselves. All my undertakings miscarry. I am like a straining eunuch. Yes, that's what he says. And this was repeated by him when he was in the last year of his life in 1889. You remember that poem, "Thou art indeed just Lord." There also he says that I am an eunuch. It's because that, not that he was not productive, but then definitely what he felt during that period when he wrote this letter, he was in the phase when he was composing those terrible sonnets. Possibly he was suffering from a disruption. The disruption is because that he felt that his connection with God has been snapped. He was lacking that spiritual inspiration. He was lacking that spiritual light within. That's why he says in that famous dark sonnet, "I waken the fill of dark, not day." So he was feeling the darkness, that spiritual darkness, and he was suffering from, in that particular poem, "I waken fill the fill of dark." If you read that, definitely you have read that, and you will find that he is talking about hepatitis, biles flowing all over the body. And this is metaphorically talking of or speaking of hepatitis or jaundice. And if you see commentators, if you see the Reader's Guide to Hopkins, there actually it is pointed out that in Reader's Guide to Hopkins, it is said that Hopkins is suffering from spiritual hepatitis. It's very aptly put, spiritual hepatitis, right? So this is the cause possibly that he called himself eunuch. But we know that even today when we are reading him, he was quite productive. But definitely as far as the spiritual side of Hopkins was concerned, that was filling this kind of a darkness. And let me point out that this was not just an individual malady. If you see the Victorian scenario, this kind of a cliffage between the material self and the spiritual self, that was very much in the Victorian psyche itself. And Hopkins, being a very sensitive poet, he was a priest over and above that. So he felt this even more strongly. So that's why he says possibly that I'm a eunuch. I'm not being able to productive. I'm not being able to be productive, right?
There is another question, sir, from Shreya Roy. Hopkins wrote the terrible sonnets. So how can we relate those writings with his life? Was he totally depressed when he wrote those writings?
Yes, to some extent, definitely he was feeling depressed. He was feeling dejected. And as I said, that the reason was not just religious. The reason was not just personal. Because if you see the scenario, you will find causes for external stimuli which inspired or which motivated or which made Hopkins feel like this. He was feeling this kind of a depression, or his poems reflect this dejected, depressed mood, not because of personal crisis only. My point is, again and again, I'm saying that this was a personal crisis, but that was not everything. The personal crisis was there, but it was aided by, it was to a large extent aggravated by the socio-political scenario of contemporary Ireland and England, definitely.
Jayanta, is there any question from YouTube?
Yes, Chinmoy, there was in fact
Okay,
a question
then
from YouTube, but I believe our honorable speaker has already That's discussed why about this that. Question is retracted from the YouTube.
Oh,
So
oh,
there is actually no question from YouTube.
okay.
Hello,
Hello. Yes.
sir. This is Shomadip from Rajan
Yes.
Nilkan Women's College, sir.
Yes.
Sir,
Somadev.
sir, firstly, I would like to say you good morning, unless it would turn out a good afternoon. Sir, I have a question that I actually like to have your view that Hopkins's concern and anxieties are anthropocentric or ecocentric. What do you think?
No, definitely it is ecocentric because his concern was not limited to human beings, right? You can relate his poems to even deep ecology, I think, which
Yes.
about the biotic and the abiotic of the aspects of life. So it was not just anthropocentric.
Okay.
Because
Sir, another
points. Yes, please.
Another thing that I would like to mention that we had a long discussion over the issue of this Wordsworth and Hopkins parallelism. I think that you remember that we had a long discussion over the issue, and if you kindly shed some light on Wordsworth's aesthetic concern and Hopkins's spiritual or ascetic concern. We had a long discussion over the issue.
If we let me allow to talk on Hopkins, because we talk about usually when we talk about Wordsworth, we talk about his pantheistic creed, and
Yes.
nature in Wordsworth always with a capital N usually say that, right? But then in case of Wordsworth, possibly Wordsworth was not
Yes.
exposed to the kind of destruction, as I have mentioned in my discussion during this first question, that answer to that first question, that possibly, why should I say possibly, Wordsworth definitely was not exposed to that kind of destruction of nature that Hopkins felt and Hopkins experienced. And the poems that we have discussed today, and in many other poems, you will feel that Hopkins is talking about, in no uncertain terms, he's talking about, or he's rather lamenting. This lament you hardly find in Wordsworth. That is a major difference between the two, because nature is being destroyed for the sake of industry, for the sake of material progress. As I said, that Hopkins was not against industrialization as such, not against science as such, the progress of science, and his interest in physics, his interest in thermodynamics, his interest in environment. These were issues that keep him as, or place him as one of the most important Victorian poets who showed concern for environment and science. So he was not against all these things, but at the same time, he definitely lamented man's severance from God and his own inner spiritual being because of too much engrossment, because of too much involvement with the material progress of Victorian society. Right.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Is there any other question? Okay, sir. There is no more questions. Let us towards Thanksgiving session, and on behalf of the Department of English of both Kharagpur College and IGRA SSB College, I, Chinmay Mandal, would like to thank Professor Gautam Buddha Sudal sir for giving us his kind consent to deliver a lecture in our online lecture series for our students and scholars. And it was really, sir, an informative, illuminating, awestruck, and well-researched talk, sir. And no word is enough to describe your way of discussion. It has been a matter of great pleasure, sir, to listen you time and time again. Hope we will get your kind consent again whenever we try to organize such online or offline lectures.
Okay. Always will
finally,
get my cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, I would like to thank all students, teachers, organizers, and scholars across the globe for their kind cooperation with. And with these words of greetings, I do hereby declare the end of today's session.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.